The gavel hit wood like a gunshot. Lot 47, and the auctioneer's voice carried no particular interest, no inflection suggesting anything worth leaning forward for. 3 acres on Mill Creek Road, one Quonset hut, condition listed as salvage. A few people in the folding chairs chuckled, the soft automatic laughter of those watching someone else's misfortune pass across the auction block like weather. Eleanor Marsh did not laugh. She did not blink. She sat on a metal chair in the third row with her spine pressed flat against the backrest and her right hand buried in her coat pocket. Fingers wrapped around an envelope containing $900 in cash. Every bill folded tight, creased and recreased, until the paper had gone soft at the edges, as though folding could somehow make money last longer than money ever lasts. Beside her, Harold breathed in the shallow, careful rhythm she had memorized over the past 3 years, the sound of lungs working harder than lungs should have to work. At his feet, Biscuit lay with his chin on his paws and his amber eyes tracking every stranger in the room with the watchful patience of a sentry who still believed his post mattered even if no one else did. The auction hall smelled of dust and old wood, and the chemical sweetness of floor polish applied over decades of boot scuffs. Bert Calloway stood behind a podium that had seen better centuries, his reading glasses perched on a nose reddened by 40 Iowa winters. He flipped a page in his catalog without urgency. Opening bid, 500. No hand rose. The room held perhaps 30 people, most of them there for the residential lots and the equipment packages that would come later. Lot 47 was filler. Background noise, 400. Bert scanned the room with the professional patience of a man paid by the hour. Anyone 400 for 3 acres and a structure. Come on, folks. Silence settled like sediment. Someone in the back row coughed. A woman 2 seats down from Ellie unwrapped a cough drop with excruciating slowness. 300. Bert's eyebrows lifted slightly, performing mild incredulity for an audience that wasn't buying it. 3 acres with a structure, people. Somebody's got to want it. Ellie raised her hand. 300 to Eleanor Marsh. Heads turned. Not many, but enough. She could feel the whispers gathering like storm clouds at the edges of the room, could sense the weight of eyes landing on her and Harold and the old dog at their feet. She knew what they were thinking because she had spent 3 months learning exactly what people in Cedar Falls thought about the Marsh family now. Poor Eleanor lost her mind along with her farm, 81 years old and bidding on a rust heap with money she can't afford to spend. 300 going once, Bert announced, going twice. 350. Ellie turned her head just enough to identify the voice. Jerry Whitmore, who owned the salvage yard out on Route 20, leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed and a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't interested in 3 acres of overgrown nothing. He wanted the Quonset for scrap metal, wanted to strip the corrugated steel panels and sell them by the pound. Quick profit, no sentiment. 400. Her voice came out steady. She had practiced steadiness the way other women her age practice breathing exercises or gentle stretches. She had practiced it in the borrowed church van at 2 in the morning, when the temperature outside dropped below 0, and Harold's cough rattled the windows. She had practiced it in grocery store lines, when the cashier's eye slid past her face with the particular blankness reserved for people who had become invisible. Steadiness was a skill. Ellie Marsh had gotten very good at it. Jerry's smirk faded into something more calculating, the squint of a man running numbers he didn't particularly like. 450. Harold's hand found her forearm. His grip was light but insistent, and she could feel the tremor in his fingers that had nothing to do with cold. They had agreed on 800 as their maximum. Every dollar above that line was a dollar they might need for food, for gas, for the medications Harold's lungs demanded, and their vanished insurance no longer covered. 500. The whispers became less careful about volume. Somebody, Ellie thought it might be Carl Hendris, whose dairy operation bordered the old Marsh property line before the bank took everything, muttered something about throwing good money after bad. The phrase arrived with the dull familiarity of a bruise pressed too often. Jerry Whitmore studied her for a long moment. His eyes moved from Ellie to Harold to Biscuit, and then to some private calculation behind his own face. Then he shook his head, uncrossed his arms, and settled deeper into his chair. Too rich for my blood. You want that rust heap, it's yours. 500 to Eleanor Marsh. Bert confirmed with neither judgment nor congratulation, going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the room like the period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish. Sold. The paperwork took less than 20 minutes. Ellie signed her name in the spaces Bert indicated, each signature steady and unhurried. The penmanship of a woman who had spent 60 years signing checks and invoices and equipment leases and veterinary authorizations for a 200-acre farm that no longer belonged to her. She handed over $500 in cash. Bert counted it twice, wrote a receipt, and handed her a key that looked like it hadn't turned a lock since the Eisenhower administration. The deed would be filed with the county within the week. They walked out of the auction house into pale March sunlight that carried no warmth. Biscuit pressed close to Harold's right side, positioning himself exactly where Harold could reach down and rest a hand on the dog's broad back for balance, without appearing to need balance. It was a trick Biscuit had developed years ago, back when Harold's unsteadiness was something they could pretend was temporary. Ellie could feel the amused pity following them from the building, like a draft through a cracked door. The specific quality of attention that people direct at someone they have already written off. Eleanor Marsh. She didn't turn around. She recognized the voice anyway. Carl Hendris, confirming her earlier guess. His tone carried the particular authority of a man who had never lost anything he couldn't replace. What in God's name are you going to do with that worthless piece of land? Live on it. The laughter that followed them to the church van was the kind that expects to be proven right. It carried across the gravel parking lot and caught in the bare branches of the elm trees lining Main Street and hung there like something waiting to fall. Ellie helped Harold into the passenger seat, while Biscuit jumped into the back with the practiced ease of a dog who had been getting in and out of vehicles his entire working life. The van belonged to First Methodist on loan through the generosity of Pastor Williams, and the quiet guilt of a congregation that had watched two of its oldest members lose everything and done nothing but offer parking lot charity and casseroles that stopped coming after the second week. The drive to Mill Creek Road took them through the heart of Cedar Falls, past the hardware store where Ellie had bought supplies for 6 decades, where the owner knew her by name and her account number, and the particular gauge of fencing wire she preferred. Past the diner where she and Harold had eaten breakfast every Saturday morning for 40 years. Always the same booth by the window. Always coffee first, and then eggs and toast and whatever pie Marge had made that morning. Past the bank that had foreclosed on neighbors during the farm crisis of the 80s. Neighbors Ellie had helped feed and clothe and carry through the worst years of their lives, without being asked and without keeping count. Nobody had offered to help the Marshes. The streets of Cedar Falls scrolled by like a film strip of a life being rewound, and Ellie watched them pass with the specific attention of someone who knows she is seeing something for the last time in its familiar form. She would come back to these streets. She would walk these sidewalks again, but she would never again be the woman she had been when these places knew her. And the places would never again look at her the way they once had. You're quiet. Harold's voice was gentle. Even at 82, with his lungs scarred by decades of textile mill dust and his body thinner than it had been since their wedding day. Harold Marsh had a way of hearing what silence actually meant. He had been doing it since they were 19 years old, and she had tried to convince him she didn't care whether he asked her to the harvest dance or took Betty Palmer instead. Just thinking about what people said back there. Doesn't matter what they say. No, it doesn't. But it still hurts. She reached across the console and took his hand. His fingers were bonier than they used to be, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the skin papery and spotted with age. But his grip was still strong, still certain. I'm going to build us something, Harold. I don't know exactly what yet, but I'm going to build us a place that's ours. A place to live. and I'm going to do it with whatever we've got left. That's $400 and a Quonset held together by rust and prayers. And you. And Biscuit. That's not nothing. Biscuit's tail thumped against the vinyl seat at the sound of his name. One thump definitive like an endorsement cast in a vote only he understood. The farm had been in the Marsh family for 4 generations. 200 acres of Iowa bottomland that Ellie's grandfather had cleared with a mule and a borrowed plow that her father had expanded and modernized, that she and Harold had operated since their wedding year of 1962. The soil was black and deep and forgiving, the kind of dirt that made other farmers drive slowly past your fence line with envy in their eyes. Dennis had taken it in 3 years. Their eldest son, 55 years old, a degree in finance from Iowa State, a corner office in Des Moines, with a view of the river. Dennis had come home for Thanksgiving 3 years ago with a leather portfolio and a vocabulary full of words like optimization and asset allocation and fiduciary responsibility. He'd sat across from Ellie at the kitchen table, the same table where she had fed him oatmeal at age 4, and helped him with algebra at 12, and watched him open college acceptance letters at 18, and explained that their retirement could be so much more comfortable if they would simply sign a few documents transferring financial authority to his management. He was their son. They trusted him because trust was the default condition of a family, the gravity that held everything in orbit. Ellie signed, Harold signed, and Dennis took the trust they offered and converted it into leverage. The investments failed. That part was true enough. The high-risk fund Dennis had chosen cratered in a market correction that wiped out principal like fire through dry brush. But what Dennis did next was the act that transformed failure into betrayal. He used the farmer's collateral to cover the losses, signing documents that put 200 acres of marshland on the wrong side of a debt it could never repay. He did this without telling them, without asking, without the smallest hesitation that Ellie could later identify as evidence of a conscience. The bank sent notices. Dennis intercepted them. The bank sent registered letters. Dennis explained them away as routine correspondence. Nothing to worry about. He was handling everything. By the time Ellie understood what had happened, the foreclosure was already in motion, and the machinery of institutional indifference had built too much momentum to stop. The last day on the farm lived in Ellie's memory like a wound that would not scar over. She stood in the kitchen and watched strangers carry her mother's china cabinet through the front door. Dorothy's cabinet, the one Walter had built as a wedding present in 1947. The one that had held 4 generations of holiday dinners and Sunday suppers and birthday cakes. Ellie had called Dennis from the kitchen phone, her voice shaking for the first and only time. "They're taking your grandmother's things, Dennis. They're carrying them out of the house right now." His response arrived with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had already moved past the problem and resented being asked to look back at it. "Mom, I'm in a meeting. You should really start looking into assisted living options. I'll send you some brochures." Karen, their daughter, had been more concise. A text message that Ellie read standing in the driveway while Harold sat in the church van with Biscuit and the last box of photographs they had been allowed to keep. "Mom, I don't have a spare room. You should try the church." Stephen, the youngest, had sent a card. A greeting card with a picture of a sunset on the front and the words, "Thinking of you," printed in gold script. Inside, in Stephen's careful handwriting, "I'm sorry, Mom and Dad. I should have done more." He'd included $200 in cash, which was not enough to do anything with, and was too much to throw away, and which Ellie had folded into the envelope with the rest of their money. Because when you have nothing, everything counts. She and Harold had spent the winter in First Methodist parking lot. 3 months in a borrowed van in an Iowa winter, with a propane heater that ran out twice, and a dog who wedged himself between them at night and kept them alive with his body heat. Ellie was not being dramatic about this. Without Biscuit, the January cold would have finished what Dennis started. The congregation brought casseroles for the first 2 weeks. Then the casserole stopped and the visit stopped and the world went back to normal for everyone except the 2 old people and the dog in the parking lot, who had become so easy to not see that eventually nobody saw them at all. During those months in the church parking lot, Ellie noticed another family, a young couple with two small children sleeping in a pickup truck 3 spaces away. She learned their names from Pastor Williams Jake and Megan Whitfield. Lost their farm to medical debt after their youngest boy needed heart surgery. The bills came like waves, each one larger than the last, until the tide simply took everything. Ellie watched Megan through the van's window one February morning. Watched the young woman carry her baby across the frozen parking lot. The child bundled so thick he looked like a small cotton bale. Megan's face was young, but her eyes were old-aged past their years by the specific exhaustion of a mother who cannot provide shelter for her children. Ellie wanted to help. She wanted to cross those 3 parking spaces and offer something, anything, some piece of comfort or practical wisdom that might ease the weight. But she had nothing to offer. She was as broke and as stranded as they were. The only thing she could do was make a promise to herself silently, with Biscuit asleep across her lap, and Harold's ragged breathing filling the van. If she ever had the ability to help someone standing where she was standing now, she would not look away. She would not find herself too busy. She would not send a text message suggesting they try the church. They arrived at the property as the afternoon light began to soften the sun descending toward a horizon line of bare trees and brown fields that would not show green for another month. Ellie had prepared herself for disappointment. She had steeled herself against the possibility that standing here as the owner would feel exactly as hopeless as standing here as a stranger had felt 2 weeks ago when she drove out alone to inspect the lot. But something was different. Not the land itself, which was still overgrown and neglected, or the Quonset which still rose from the earth like something the earth was trying to forget. The difference was internal. She owned this ground. Her name would be on the deed. Nobody could take it from her because nobody wanted it, and there was a kind of freedom in possessing something that no one else desired. Biscuit jumped down from the van and immediately began circling the perimeter of the Quonset with his nose to the ground and his tail held level with his back, the posture of a working dog investigating something important. Not the casual curiosity of a pet sniffing new territory, but the methodical sweep of an animal with 11 years of farm experience cataloging information humans couldn't detect. The structure rose from the overgrown land like something half remembered from a dream about the war. Its curved steel panels streaked with rust, the color of dried blood. Weeds had pushed through cracks in the concrete pad that served as its floor. The main door, a massive sliding panel on rusted tracks, stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within, 50 feet long at least, maybe more, and 20 feet across at its widest point. A relic of the post-war era, one of those corrugated steel half-cylinders that farmers had once used for everything from grain storage to equipment shelter to makeshift housing, where nothing better was available and something was better than nothing. Ellie walked the perimeter of the property while Harold rested against the van, and Biscuit continued his inspection. 3 acres didn't sound like much, not compared to 200. But as she paced the boundary, stepping over fallen branches and through stands of dead grass that would green up in another month, she began to understand why someone had chosen this particular piece of land. The topography was gentle, sloping slightly toward a creek that ran along the eastern edge, its water brown and cold with snow melt. The soil visible where winter had killed back the vegetation was dark and rich. Bottomland, the kind of dirt that would grow anything you asked it to grow, and some things you didn't. A stand of mature oaks clustered near the northwest corner, their bare branches interlocking against the sky like a cathedral ceiling, providing natural windbreak and future firewood. And the Quonset itself sat on the highest point of the 3 acres, safe from any flooding the creek might bring. This was not random land. Someone had evaluated this ground with the eye of a person who understood what soil needed and what water did, and where the wind came from in January. Someone had chosen these 3 acres out of all the available land in the county, the way a general chooses high ground. Ellie knew who that someone was. She didn't know how or why not yet, but she knew. She returned to the Quonset and placed her palm flat against the metal door. Cold beneath her hand, even in the weak March sunshine, the rough texture of corrosion gritty against her skin. But when she pushed, the door moved more easily than she had expected, sliding back on its track with a groan that carried across the empty land and startled a pair of crows from the oak trees. Light fell into the interior in a golden shaft, a single beam of late afternoon sun that cut through the dust and illuminated what had been hidden in darkness for decades. Ellie's breath caught. The Quonset was not empty. Against the far wall, draped in canvas tarps, now grey with decades of accumulated dust, stood shapes that 60 years of farming allowed Ellie to identify without removing a single covering. Equipment, machinery, the outline of what was almost certainly a tractor. The angular profile of a hay baler. Various implements stacked and arranged with the precision of someone who understood their value and expected them to be needed again. Harold had followed her, picking his way through the tall grass with one hand trailing along Biscuit's back for balance. He reached the doorway and looked in, and she heard his intake of breath. Is that equipment old by the looks of it? But equipment. Biscuit pushed past both of them into the interior, his nails clicking on the concrete with purposeful rhythm. He did not wander. He moved through the space like an inspector with a checklist, passing the shrouded machinery without pause, navigating around crates and shelving units and stacked wooden pallets with the confidence of a dog who knew exactly where he was going. He went directly to a corner of the Quonset where industrial shelving units stood bolted to the curved steel wall, their heavy gauge frames supporting rows of boxes and cans and containers. Then he sat and looked back at Ellie with an expression of alert expectation. Ears forward, eyes bright, tail still. The exact posture he adopted the day he found the breach in the north fence line that would have led the whole herd into the county road. The exact posture from the spring morning he led Ellie to a newborn calf that had wandered from its mother during a thunderstorm and was lying in a drainage ditch, hypothermic, and barely breathing in a spot Ellie never would have searched. Biscuit found things. That was his gift, the inexplicable talent that set him apart from every other dog Ellie had owned in a lifetime of owning dogs. He found broken fences and lost animals and water leaks, and the one spot in the barn where the roof was about to give way. He found what needed finding, and he found it before anyone else knew it was lost. Ellie followed him, picking her way carefully around the shrouded equipment. The shelving unit was industrial heavy-duty steel bolted to the Quonset's wall, its shelves loaded with boxes and cans and containers that defied immediate identification in the dim light. But it was what sat on the bottom shelf that made Ellie stop walking and stop breathing and stop thinking about anything except the object in front of her. A metal box about the size of a small suitcase, secured with a padlock that had long since rusted into uselessness. Army green. The specific shade of olive drab that had been standard issue for military surplus in the years after World War II. Stenciled on its side, barely visible beneath decades of dust and the slow chemical patience of oxidation, were 3 letters. WTM. Ellie knew those letters the way she knew her own heartbeat. Walter Thomas Marsh. Her father, Harold. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, as though it were coming from a different room or a different year. Come look at this. She carried the box outside into the fading light and set it on the tailgate of the van with hands that had not trembled when she bid on a property everyone laughed at, but trembled now, holding a dead man's secrets in the last golden light of a March afternoon. Biscuit sat at her feet and watched with the intensity of a creature who could sense frequencies of meaning that human senses were not built to receive. Harold stood at her shoulder. Their shadows stretched eastward across the gravel, long and thin. The padlock gave way with a twist. Inside the box, preserved by the sealed container and the cool, dry interior of the Quonset, lay a collection of items arranged with the meticulous care of a man who wanted things found in a particular order. On top, a leather journal, its cover cracked with age but structurally intact, the binding still holding. Beneath that, a stack of photographs held together with a rubber band that crumbled at Ellie's touch, the images spilling across the tailgate like a hand of cards dealt from another lifetime. Official-looking documents in manila folders, their edges yellowed, but their contents legible. A pocket watch with a stopped face, the crystal scratched but unbroken, the hands frozen at 4:47. And at the very bottom, beneath everything else, a hand-drawn map annotated in handwriting that Ellie recognized as certainly as she would recognize her own face in a mirror. Her father's handwriting. The blocky, precise letters of a man who had learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse and had never seen the point of cursive. Your father never mentioned any of this. Dad never talked about the years before he married Mom. She said the past was past and he never argued with her about anything. Walter Thomas Marsh had been a man of few words and fewer explanations. He returned from the war in 1945, bought the farm in Cedar Falls the following year, married Dorothy in 1947, and worked the land until his heart stopped on an October morning in 1978. He died the way he lived, quietly, without drama, between the barn and the house, with his boots on and his work gloves still in his back pocket. Ellie was 35 years old when she buried her father, and she had spent the 46 years since then believing she knew everything important about who he was. She opened the journal, carefully aware that the pages might disintegrate if handled roughly. The binding crackled but held. The first entry was dated August 1946, written in pencil that had faded to a ghostly gray but remained legible. I found a place to start over. 3 acres on Mill Creek Road with a Quonset I can convert to storage. Nobody knows about the money yet, and I aim to keep it that way until I'm sure who I can trust. The farm is the priority. Everything else can wait. Money. Ellie turned to Harold. He talks about money, something he was hiding. Keep reading. The entries spanned nearly 2 years, each one brief and practical. The journal of a man who recorded facts rather than feelings. Walter's purchase of the Mill Creek property, which Ellie now understood her father had secretly owned alongside the main farm for over 30 years. His careful stockpiling of equipment and supplies. His cryptic references to the account and the arrangement never explained, never elaborated upon, as though he were writing for an audience who would already understand. One entry dated March 1948 made Ellie's hands go still. The banker in Des Moines says the certificates have matured nicely. I've added the Mill Creek deed to the deposit box. Someday when the time is right, this will all go to whoever needs it most. I've seen what happens when families fight over money. Better to let it wait until it finds the right hands. Ellie looked at Biscuit. The dog had not moved from his position at her feet, his amber eyes fixed on her face with an attention that felt less like observation and more like witness. He left something behind, Harold. Dad bought this property separate from the farm. He stored equipment here, supplies, and something in Des Moines. Certificates, investments maybe. And no one knew, no one. Not Mom, not me. He kept it completely separate. Harold's hand found her arm, his grip carrying the weight of a connection he needed her to hear. When Dennis did all that financial maneuvering, the farm was all anyone knew about. This property, whatever's in Des Moines, Dennis couldn't have touched it because Dennis didn't know it existed. The implication settled over Ellie like a blanket pulled up in the dark warmth arriving before comprehension. For the first time in 3 months, she felt something that had abandoned her on the day she watched strangers carry her mother's china cabinet through the front door of a house that had been home for 4 generations. Hope, but fragile hope. Uncertain hope. Whatever Walter Marsh had left behind might amount to nothing. Worthless certificates in a defunct bank. A storage building full of rusted machinery no one would buy. The journal was 70 years old. Banks had merged and failed, and merged again. Wars had been fought over less. Economies had collapsed over more. There was no guarantee that anything her father had set aside still existed in a form that mattered. Still, Ellie stood a little straighter. She looked at the Quonset with its rust-streaked walls and its broken-down door, and its decades of neglect, and, for the first time, she saw it not as what it was, but as what it might become. She saw walls that could be insulated, a roof that could be patched, a concrete floor that could be cleaned and divided into rooms. She saw a home that no one would recognize as a home, which meant no one would try to take it. Biscuit stood and walked to the open door of the Quonset. He paused in the threshold, silhouetted against the darkening interior, and looked back at Ellie with an expression she had come to trust more than any human opinion she had ever received. Then he stepped inside and disappeared into the shadows. A moment later, his bark echoed from the interior. Not an alarm bark, not a warning. The specific insistent sound he made when he wanted Ellie to come and see what he had found. That dog has been finding things we couldn't see our whole lives. Harold's voice quiet, warm with something that might have been wonder or might have been faith. It was hard to tell the difference. They went in together. Ellie, first Harold behind her, with his hand on Biscuit's back. The light from the open door reached only partway into the Quonset's depth, and the shadows beyond were thick with dust and years and the accumulated silence of a space that had been waiting. Biscuit stood beside one of the canvas-draped shapes, pawing at the covering, with the focused determination of a dog who knew exactly what was underneath and needed his human to see it too. Ellie grabbed the edge of the tarp and pulled. Beneath it, preserved in darkness for God knew how long, sat a 1947 Farmel Model M tractor. Red paint faded to the color of old brick, but intact. Tires flat but repairable. Engine that had probably turned over last when Harry Truman was reading briefings about a world that still believed the worst was behind it. But the tractor was not what made Ellie's throat close. Tied to the steering wheel with a piece of twine that had somehow survived the decades, its fibers holding together through stubbornness or providence or the dry cold of the Quonset's interior, was a note. Handwritten on paper now yellow with age, the pencil strokes faded, but legible in the blocky script of a man who had been dead for 46 years. The land provides for those who don't give up on it. Ellie read the words 3 times. The first time she read them as information. The second time she read them as instruction. The third time she read them as love, and her vision blurred. And she reached for the steering wheel not to hold the note, but to hold the closest thing to her father she had touched since 1978. He knew. Somehow she managed her voice, barely a whisper aimed at no one and everyone. He knew. Harold stood beside her, his arm around her waist. Biscuit leaned into both their legs, a warm counterweight against the cold enormity of what they had just discovered. Knew what? Ellie looked at the tractor, the equipment surrounding it at the Quonset that everyone in Cedar Falls had laughed at, and her father had secretly prepared across 30 years of quiet, patient, invisible labor. She looked at the note tied to the steering wheel, and she understood with the sudden clarity of a light switched on in a familiar room that Walter Thomas Marsh had not been a cold man or a distant man or a man who didn't know how to love his family. He had been a terrified man, a man who went to war at 22 and came home at 25 with his laughter removed like a tooth, and his trust in the world's stability shattered beyond any repair that time or peace or prosperity could offer. And the only way he knew to express his love was to prepare, to save, to hide away provisions for a disaster he prayed would never come but could not stop expecting. Because he had seen what the world could do when it decided to take everything from you without warning and without apology. That someday his daughter would need a place to start over. Outside, the sun finished its descent and painted the sky in shades of amber and gold that no one had ordered and no one could own. The Quonset's curved roof caught the last light, and for a single moment glowed not like rust, not like ruin, but like something precious that the world had misplaced and was only now remembering. They spent their first night on the Mill Creek property in the church van with Biscuit wedged between them. Ellie lay awake for most of it, listening to Harold's breathing and the distant murmur of the creek and the occasional creak of the Quonset's metal skin expanding and contracting with the temperature. She held the journal against her chest and let her mind do what minds do when they have been given a single candle after months in the dark. She thought about her father, about the laughing boy who left Cedar Falls in 1942 and the quiet man who came back in 1945. About the way he used to stand at the edge of the property at dusk, scanning the horizon with eyes that seemed to be looking for something that never arrived. Everyone in town had called him hard-working and reliable and a good man, And all of those things were true, and none of them captured the thing that Ellie was only now beginning to understand. Walter Marsh had been afraid, not of any particular enemy or specific catastrophe, but of the general principle that the world could reach into your life at any moment and take the things you loved and leave you standing in the wreckage with nothing but your hands and your will and the terrible knowledge that love by itself was not enough to protect the people you loved. And so he had prepared. Quietly, methodically over decades, he had built a second foundation beneath the visible life of the Marsh family, a hidden infrastructure of savings and supplies and contingency plans that no one knew about, because telling people about it would have meant trusting people, and Walter had learned in a war that trust was the first casualty of any catastrophe. Ellie understood this now in a way she could not have understood it 3 months ago. 3 months ago, she had still believed that family was a reliable structure, that children loved their parents the way the sun rose in the east automatically and without condition. 3 months in a parking lot had taught her otherwise, and the lesson had carved a space in her understanding that her father's journal now filled with terrible precision. She wondered if she was more like her father than she had ever known, practical, stubborn, expressing love through action rather than declaration. Had she raised her children the same way Walter had raised her, showing devotion through sacrifice while somehow failing to teach them that sacrifice was supposed to flow in both directions? Had she built a family that understood receiving but never learned reciprocity? The question was too large for a March night in a borrowed van. She set it aside and let Biscuit's warmth pull her toward a sleep that, when it finally came, was deeper and less haunted than any she had known in months. Dawn arrived with the sharp bite of late winter and the faint green smell of things preparing to grow. Ellie eased out of the van, careful not to wake Harold. Biscuit lifted his head, amber eyes questioning, but she gestured for him to stay. The dog settled back down, though his gaze followed her through the window with the steady attention of a creature who had made her safety his life's work and did not intend to retire. She walked the property in the early light, really seeing it for the first time as something that belonged to her. The creek ran clear and cold along the eastern boundary, its banks muddy with snowmelt but sound. The oak trees stood like sentinels along the northwest corner, their bare branches already showing the swollen buds that meant leaves were coming. The soil beneath her boots, where she kicked aside dead grass to check it, was dark and moist and alive with earthworms that scattered from the sudden light. Walter Marsh had not bought junk. He had bought potential and hidden it behind rust and neglect, and the comfortable assumption that nothing valuable could exist in a place that looked like nothing. By the time she returned to the van, Harold was awake and had managed to coax their small camp stove to life. The smell of coffee cut through the morning chill, weak and thin, made from grounds they had already used twice but present. An act of normalcy in a life that had forgotten what normal felt like. You were walking the land. Dad knew what he was doing. This property, it's good land, Harold. The soil, the water, the drainage, the windbreak. He chose this spot the way he chose everything, carefully, with a plan. So what's the plan? Two things. First, we make the Quonset livable. Basic shelter somewhere to sleep that isn't this van. Second, we get to Des Moines. Find what Dad left in that deposit box. Des Moines is 150 miles. That's gas money we don't have. I know. That's why we start here. Some of what Dad stored is worth money. Not the tractor, not yet, but there's a set of hand tools on the wall in there. World War II era military quality full set with paint outlines marking every position. Antique collectors pay real money for complete sets like that. And there's a John Deere disc harrow from the 50s with no structural damage. You already inventoried the place. I was up early. Harold studied her over the rim of his cup, and something in his expression shifted from concern to recognition. The look of a man watching his wife become herself again after a long illness. The look of a man who had fallen in love with exactly this: the practical intelligence, the refusal to be defeated, the ability to see a path forward through terrain that offered no obvious trail. But she did not know. Could not know, standing in the thin March sunshine with her dog and her husband and her father's secrets, that the news of her purchase had already traveled beyond Cedar Falls. that Dennis, 150 miles west in his Des Moines office, had heard about the Quonset on Mill Creek Road, that he was already asking questions about his mother's legal status, about inheritance law, about whether assets discovered on property could be claimed by family members who had not been consulted about the purchase. The laughter from the auction house had carried further than she thought, and it had reached ears that were listening for exactly this kind of information. Frank Olson's feed store smelled the way it had smelled for 40 years. Seed corn and leather, and the sweet mineral tang of livestock supplements stacked in 50-pound bags along the back wall. Ellie pushed through the front door on a Tuesday morning, alone, having left Harold and Biscuit at Mill Creek, with instructions to rest that she knew neither of them would follow. The bell above the door announced her arrival, and the two farmers standing near the register stopped talking with the abruptness of men caught in the middle of a sentence they didn't want overheard. Frank looked up from his paperwork. His face moved through its transition surprise first, then the discomfort of a man confronting someone he had failed, then a careful neutrality that fooled no one. Ellie. His voice carried the weight of everything he hadn't said for 3 months. Frank. She crossed the store without hesitation, aware of the other customers finding sudden interest in merchandise they had no intention of buying. I have equipment to sell. World War II-era hand tools, complete set, military-grade original paint outlines on the pegboard. And a John Deere disc harrow 1950 structurally sound. I need cash, and I need it fast. Frank's eyes narrowed into the calculating squint of a man who had been buying and selling since before either of them needed reading glasses. World War II complete set. Those have collector value. I know a dealer who specializes in agricultural antiques out of Waterloo. Could be $600 to $800 for the tools alone. Where'd you get them? My property. Sure, he caught himself. The Quonset, Mill Creek Road, that's right. Something shifted behind Frank's eyes. Not pity, Ellie would have walked out if she'd seen pity, but something adjacent, the particular expression of a man recalculating a situation he had dismissed too quickly. People are talking, Ellie, saying you've lost your mind buying that rusted heap. People have been wrong about me before. Frank studied her for a long moment. Then he did something that rearranged Ellie's understanding of what was still possible between old friends. He came around the counter, crossed the distance between them, and extended his hand. I'm sorry. His voice dropped low enough that the other customers couldn't hear, though they were certainly trying. About everything. What your kids did. How this town treated you afterward. I should have come to you. I should have shown up at that parking lot with more than good intentions I never acted on. That's on me. Ellie took his hand. The grip was rough and warm and carried 60 years of shared history in its calluses. You're here now. That's enough. The deal closed in minutes. Frank would connect her with the Waterloo dealer, handle the disc harrow himself, pay cash $700 for the lot, fair price, no games. He wrote directions to the property on the back of a receipt, and Ellie folded it into her pocket beside the diminishing envelope of bills that constituted everything she owned in liquid form. She was at the door when Frank's voice caught her. Ellie, whatever you're building out there, some of us remember what your family meant to this town. Some of us should have said so sooner. Frank arrived the next morning as promised, driving his flatbed truck up the access road with the careful attention of a man navigating terrain he hadn't expected to revisit. He loaded the disc harrow with the efficiency of someone who had moved farm equipment his entire life. But when the job was done, he didn't leave. Instead, he unloaded 2 items from the truck's cab, a propane space heater, nearly new, and 2 full tanks. My wife cleaned out the garage. She was going to donate these anyway. Ellie recognized the lie for what it was, an act of generosity wrapped in a fiction that allowed both of them to preserve their dignity. The heater's price tag was still attached to the power cord, partially hidden by a fold of cardboard. She accepted it without argument. There were moments when pride was a luxury, and this was one of them. That evening, with $700 added to the $400 they had left, $1,100 total, more than they'd held at one time since the eviction, Ellie allowed herself to walk through the Quonset with new purpose. not just cataloging what was there, but planning what it could become. She moved between the shrouded equipment and the stacked crates, mentally mapping partition walls and kitchen space and sleeping quarters when her boot struck something that didn't sound like concrete. She stopped, knelt. The floor beneath a row of heavy wooden crates rang hollow when she knocked on it, a different resonance than the solid slab elsewhere, the unmistakable acoustic signature of empty space below. 60 years of farm life had taught her to listen to what buildings told you when you bothered to ask. She shifted the crates, heavy, full of God knew what. But she was a woman who had spent her life lifting things that were heavier than her body, said she should be able to lift, and found what the crates had been hiding. A door. Not the main entrance, not anything obvious. A human-sized hatch set into a steel frame welded directly to the Quonset's curved wall, fitted with a padlock of the same vintage and brand as the one on Walter's metal box. Rusted, ancient, and defeated in seconds by the bolt cutters she retrieved from the tool wall. The door opened onto darkness, and a smell that made Ellie's stomach clench with unexpected recognition. Earth and concrete motor oil and old paper. The specific perfume of root cellars and underground spaces where time moves at a different speed. There's a cellar. Ellie heard her own disbelief as clearly as Harold did. Dad built a cellar under the Quonset. Biscuit descended the concrete steps without hesitation, his nails clicking into the blackness below, with the confidence of a dog who trusted the ground even when he couldn't see it. Ellie found a kerosene lantern on the shelf, one of several, their reservoirs still full, lit it with matches that had somehow remained viable across the decades and followed. The cellar was perhaps 30 feet square. Poured concrete walls and floor, cold even through Ellie's worn boots. Shelving lined every wall, stacked with supplies more personal than what she'd found above. Boxes labeled in Walter's handwriting. Photos. Letters. Army records. A trunk with his name stenciled on the side, the same trunk that had accompanied him to Europe and back. And in the center of the space, on a small wooden table, another metal box, newer than the first, its lock still functional despite the underground humidity. Inside, a second letter from Walter, this one more detailed than the journal entries. Specific instructions: the safety deposit box number 443 at First Federal Bank of Des Moines. The key's location. Contingency directions in case the bank had changed names, which it had 3 times. Legal language authorizing Ellie to claim the contents. Walter had thought of everything, had anticipated complications that wouldn't arise for decades, had written instructions for a world he would not live to see. The cellar also held the provisions of a man preparing for siege. Wool blankets wrapped in paper, kerosene, copper wire, nails and screws sorted by size into coffee cans, canned food with labels faded but seals intact. Everything a person would need to transform a steel shell into a livable home, stored underground, where moisture and temperature remained constant, preserved by the same patient foresight that had preserved the investments in Des Moines. Ellie stood in her father's cellar, surrounded by the evidence of a love so thorough. It had anticipated needs she hadn't known she would have, and understood that Walter Marsh had not merely hoped his daughter would be safe. He had engineered it. That first night, sleeping inside the Quonset on camp beds made from the preserved wool blankets spread over wooden pallets, with the space heater pushing a circle of warmth into the steel cathedral around them. Harold's breathing sounded different. Not the labored rasp of the parking lot months, but something quieter, less desperate. The breathing of a man whose lungs had decided to try again. Biscuit lay at the foot of their makeshift bed, his body heat radiating upward through the blankets. Occasionally his legs twitched in sleep, chasing rabbits or memories or whatever private cinema plays behind a dog's closed eyes. Tomorrow, Harold's voice emerged from the darkness. Des Moines, are you up for the drive? I've been feeling stronger since we got here. Having something to wake up for, it changes things. She reached across the darkness and found his hand. The key Walter had promised was exactly where he had said, taped to the bottom of the metal box, small and brass and impossibly bright, for something that had spent decades underground. Ellie had been carrying it in her breast pocket since the cellar. The weight of it against her sternum, a constant reminder of what might be waiting 150 miles west. But before Des Moines, the land had one more thing to reveal. Morning came sharp and bright, and Ellie was walking the northern edge of the property when Biscuit diverged from his usual patrol route. At the shallow depression she had noticed on their first morning, the slight hollow where the grass grew a shade greener, the dog's trajectory narrowed from general patrol to specific investigation. Farm dogs have been finding water for centuries. The skill is not supernatural. It is the product of a nose that can detect moisture concentrations in soil at depths a human hand could never reach, paired with the intelligence of a breed developed to solve problems the farmer hadn't identified yet. Biscuit sat, looked at Ellie, pawed the earth twice deliberately. Ellie knelt and pressed her palm flat against the ground, damp. Not from rain, none in 10 days, but from below. She dug her fingers in and pulled up a handful, dark saturated in a way the surrounding earth was not. Walter had built his Quonset within 40 feet of a shallow aquifer. He had chosen this location not only for its elevation and its soil and its windbreak, but for its water. Ellie marked the spot with a stake. Biscuit watched with the satisfied expression of a professional whose recommendation has been accepted. Biscuit found water. Biscuit confirmed what Dad already knew. They left for Des Moines before the sun had fully committed to the sky. Biscuit arranged himself across the back seat with his chin resting on the box of documents, journal key, license, death certificate. The dog's posture suggested he had appointed himself guardian and took the responsibility with full seriousness. 150 miles of Iowa highway. Fields still winter brown but hinting at green. Ellie had called ahead. First Federal Bank of Des Moines no longer existed. Absorbed by Prairie Savings, merged with Heartland Trust. Acquired by Prairie Trust Financial in 2015. But through 3 name changes and 2 corporate restructurings, Safety Deposit Box 443 had endured. Susan Holloway met them in the lobby. A woman in her 50s with brown hair beginning its transition to silver, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had chosen banking because she liked solving problems for real people. She looked at Biscuit. Service dog, farm dog, best friend I've ever had. We have policies about service animals, but no policy about best friends. As long as he behaves, he's welcome. Biscuit adopted a posture of such exaggerated dignity that Harold nearly laughed. The vault was in the basement. Susan examined Ellie's documentation with professional thoroughness. Everything appears to be in order. There's the matter of back rent. Roughly $240 since 2020. Ellie's stomach dropped. However, given the circumstances and this box's history with our institution, I'm authorized to waive that fee. 2 keys turned together. The box slid free. Susan left them alone. Ellie lifted the lid. Stock certificates bundled in rubber bands that had crumbled, held together only by the pressure of the box. Bearer bonds in denominations that made the numbers swim. A savings passbook from First Federal showing a 1985 balance of $47,000 annotated in Walter's handwriting, converted to CD annual rollover, and beneath the financial instruments 2 letters. Walter's letter confirmed what the seller instructions had outlined and added what instructions could not contain. He wrote that he was sorry for not telling her while he was alive, that he had seen families destroyed by the knowledge of money and had wanted her to build her life with her own hands. He wrote, "You come from people who survived worse. You have your mother's faith and my stubbornness, and that combination can weather any storm. I love you, Ellie." I should have said it more when I had the chance. Dorothy's letter was written on paper that carried the faint memory of flowers. She addressed Ellie directly by name, with none of Walter's formality. She wrote that the plan had been theirs together, hers and Walter's, born from watching other families tear themselves apart over money they hadn't earned. Use what's here to build something good. Use it to help people who need help. Wealth isn't what you have. It's what you do with it. Ellie sat in the basement vault of a Des Moines bank and let the tears come. Not controlled, not private. The full, unguarded weeping of a daughter who has just learned that her parents' love was larger and more carefully constructed than anything she had imagined across 46 years of believing she understood them. Harold's hand found her shoulder. Biscuit's head found her thigh steady and warm. How much? I don't know exactly, but if they're worth what they appear to be worth, hundreds of thousands, maybe more. Tom Redhawk's call came 8 days later on a Thursday morning that began with fog along the creek. "It's real, Ellie. All of it." Tom's voice carried the careful excitement of a man professionally trained to suppress it. "The stocks have done better than I estimated. The bonds are valid. The savings account has been compounding for 4 decades. You're looking at roughly $620,000. After taxes, around 500,000. My father was a farmer. He had time and patience. 60 years of compound growth. Time is the most powerful force in finance, Ellie. Your father understood that." But Tom's voice shifted then. "There's something else. Dennis has been making calls. He heard you've been working on Mill Creek, that you found things. He's asking about inheritance law. Let him come." Dennis came on a Thursday in late April, arriving in a sedan so dark and polished it looked like a wound in the landscape. Biscuit detected the intrusion before the car was visible. His head came up on the porch and his body went from relaxed to rigid between one breath and the next. Then he rose, trotted to the Quonset's main door, and positioned himself directly between the entrance and the access road. Legs planted, weight forward, not a warning, a declaration. Dennis stepped out. The suit, the shoes, the mask of concern. Ellie had watched him practice since he was 16. "Mum, we need to talk." "Talk then. I know about the investments, about the safety deposit box, about the money Grandpa hid from everyone. He didn't hide it from me. He left it for me. Left it for you, or left it for the family. We're all his descendants. We all have a legal claim." Ellie looked at her eldest son and saw him without the protective lens of maternal love for the first time. Not the boy she had raised. A stranger who had learned to treat family as a balance sheet. "You have a claim to money your grandparents saved and specifically left to me, to assets you didn't know existed, never contributed to, never earned. You stole my farm. You destroyed my retirement. You left your father and me in a parking lot in January. And now you're here because you smelled money you didn't know existed until someone told you it was there. The investments failed. The risks were disclosed. You saw two old people with assets you wanted, and you took them." Dennis dropped the mask entirely. "You can't prove I did anything illegal. I'm not interested in proving anything. I'm interested in building something, in living with purpose and dignity. You can't take that from me." Dennis turned toward his car. "I'll be back, and next time I'm bringing a lawyer." Ellie watched the sedan trail dust down the access road. Her hands trembled, not fear, but the residue of fury held in check by will alone. Biscuit left his guard position and came to her, leaning his full weight against her shins. Harold emerged from the Quonset. Dennis, he's threatening lawyers. And you, I told him what I should have told him 3 years ago." Between the confrontation and the lawsuit that followed, spring unfolded with an intensity determined to compensate for the winter before it. Ellie dug post holes, strung fence wire, turned garden beds with compost Harold maintained, like a research project. The well was dug at the spot Biscuit had identified, 22 feet down, clean water. The aquifer exactly, where instinct and one very good dog had said it would be. And between the labor, Ellie drove to the trailer park on Cedar Falls' eastern edge and knocked on the door of a single wide that shook when anyone crossed its floor. Megan Whitfield answered. 30 years old, holding a baby with a surgical scar bisecting his sternum, her face carrying the exhaustion of a mother who has been strong for so long that strength has become indistinguishable from numbness. Ellie did not offer money. She offered work. "I need help with my garden. Your husband could use time on equipment if he's going to find mechanical work. I'll pay in produce and knowledge. You come to Mill Creek, you work, you learn, you take home what we grow. Why you don't know us? Because when I was standing where you're standing, nobody helped. And I remember what that felt like. I decided I wouldn't look away. So here I am, not looking away. Megan's eyes filled with the involuntary tears that come from the shock of being seen. Ellie did not comfort her. She held out a garden trowel, Walter's military surplus steel built to outlast the century. Crying's fine. But we cry while we plant. Winter doesn't wait for anyone to feel ready. Dennis returned in June with a second car carrying a lawyer whose suit was more expensive than Dennis's and whose handshake carried the temperature of a man billing $400 an hour for the privilege of disagreeing with you. The lawsuit alleged Walter Marsh's assets constituted a family trust for all descendants. Karen signed on. Stephen declined to participate. Dennis's attorney argued that Walter's will didn't mention Mill Creek specifically, and that Ellie's $500 auction purchase, technically marital assets, created grounds for Dennis's claim to the property and everything on it. Tom Redhawk dismantled both arguments with methodical patience. Walter purchased Mill Creek in 1946 with personal funds before Ellie's birth, before any grandchild existed. His will bequeathed all assets to his only child. The $500 created no claim on assets Walter had placed on the property decades before Ellie owned it. The case would be dismissed, Tom was certain. But certainty didn't prevent 6 weeks of motions filings and phone calls timed to maximize anxiety. Every envelope from Tom's office carried potential crisis. Every ring of the phone could mean something had gone wrong. On the worst night, a Tuesday in early July, Ellie sat on the porch in the dark, stars out, creek murmuring. And she considered for the first time since the auction paying Dennis something simply to make the assault stop. She was 81. How many years of fighting remained? Biscuit woke beside her. He stood, walked across the yard in darkness and stopped beside the farmall. Sat down next to the tractor in the exact spot where she had read her father's note and looked back at her across 30 feet of starlit ground. The note was preserved elsewhere now, but the steering wheel remained, and the seat where Walter once sat and the engine Ellie was rebuilding, because her father had believed she was capable of rebuilding anything. The tractor stood in the darkness like an argument made of iron, and the dog sat beside it like a witness called to testify. Okay. She said it to the dark, to the dog, to a man who had written 8 words on a scrap of paper and trusted them to carry across 70 years. I hear you. Harold found her 10 minutes later. Ellie, your father didn't prepare all this so you could hand pieces of it to the person who burned everything else down. I know. Biscuit just reminded me. The case was dismissed in the 3rd week of July. Tom called with quiet satisfaction. Ellie thanked him, hung up, stood in the garden she had planted with Megan Whitfield, tomatoes ripening, beans climbing, corn tasseling, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had survived for approximately 30 seconds. Then she picked up her hoe and went back to work. By August, the Quonset had become something its builders would not have recognized. Solar panels on the curved roof, a bathroom plumb to the well. Biscuit found a kitchen with a real stove, a bedroom with a real bed, a workshop where the farmall waited for its final restoration surrounded by tools Walter had organized. And Jake Whitfield was learning to use with an aptitude that reminded Ellie, with a pang she didn't examine, of the son she wished Dennis had become. Jake came weekends. Megan came 3 mornings a week, the baby on a blanket in the garden. The toddler chasing Biscuit through rows with the focused determination of a child who believes catching a dog is simply a matter of wanting it enough. Harold taught Megan preserving techniques his mother had passed down in a kitchen that no longer existed. Ellie watched the young family reassemble on her land and understood what she had gotten wrong with her own children. She had given Dennis and Karen and Stephen everything, without asking anything in return, modeling sacrifice as a one-way street. They learned the lesson perfectly. Parents give children, receive no reciprocity required. With the Whitfields, she did it differently. Work for food, knowledge for labor, dignity exchanged for dignity. Megan, kneeling in the August heat, tomato juice staining her fingers, looked at Ellie with a question she'd been holding for weeks. Why did you help us? Really, kindness isn't a reward for being comfortable. It's a choice you make when you remember what it felt like to need it. The summer burned and ripened, and Ellie worked and Harold healed. Not through miracles, but through purpose and clean air, and the simple medicine of having something to wake up for. And Biscuit found things a nest of baby rabbits needing relocation fence weakened by groundhog excavation. Wild blackberries along the creek that Megan turned into jam so dark it looked like bottled night. The first autumn on Mill Creek Road arrived with a gentleness that felt like something the land had been saving. Ellie stood at the property's eastern edge, where the ground sloped toward the creek, watching leaves release from the oak trees in spirals of copper and rust, each one catching the light for a single bright moment before settling into the grass. The air carried wood smoke from the Quonset's new chimney, a project that had taken her 3 weeks of trial and cursing, and one afternoon of quietly brilliant advice from Jake Whitfield, who turned out to have an intuitive understanding of draft and ventilation that no classroom could have taught. Beneath the smoke apples ripening in the small orchard they'd planted in April, 6 trees that were barely taller than Biscuit, but already bearing fruit with the reckless optimism of things too young to know what winter meant. The farmall sat behind her in the clearing, its restoration complete. She had worked on it through the hottest months, rising before dawn to turn wrenches in the cool air, learning their engine's temperament. The way a musician learns an instrument by listening, by feeling the resistance in each bolt, by understanding that machines like people surrendered their secrets only to patience. Every gasket she replaced was a conversation with her father across 46 years of silence. Every adjustment she made to the carburetor or the timing chain felt like Walter's hands guiding hers, teaching a lesson he had always intended to teach but never found the words for while he was alive. The engine turned over for the first time on a Tuesday morning in September. It coughed, sputtered, caught and lost, and caught again, each combustion cycle fighting through decades of dormancy, until the rhythm found itself and settled into a steady, purposeful rumble that Ellie felt not in her ears, but in the center of her chest, in the place where grief and gratitude had been sharing space for months. She sat in the driver's seat for nearly an hour, going nowhere, her hands on a steering wheel. Her father's hands had gripped, listening to the sound of something broken becoming whole. Biscuit sat on the ground beside the tractor the entire time, his tail sweeping the dirt in slow arcs, the metronome of a dog who recognized completion when he saw it. Now October had painted everything in harvest colors, and Ellie felt something she had not expected to feel again. Not happiness, that word was too small and too simple for the complicated weave of loss and recovery that filled her days. Contentment. The deep, bone-level satisfaction of a woman who had been told she was finished and had answered by building a life that nobody in Cedar Falls could have predicted, least of all herself. "You're wool gathering again." Harold's voice carried across the clearing from the Quonset's porch, a proper porch now built from lumber. Ellie had milled herself from storm-fallen oaks on the property, the boards still carrying the faint perfume of fresh-cut wood. He walked toward her with a steadiness that would have been unremarkable in another man, but constituted something close to miraculous in Harold Marsh. His breathing had eased over the months, the labored rasp giving way to something quieter, more natural. Not magic, not mystical springs or blessed soil. Simply this: the human body responds when the mind stops drowning. Purpose had returned oxygen to Harold's blood, the way spring returned green to the fields gradually. And then all at once, until the change was so complete you couldn't remember what winter had looked like. Just thinking about Dad, wondering what he'd make of all this. He'd be proud. Harold reached aside and took her hand, his grip firmer than it had been in years. He'd probably also find something to criticize. "That fence post isn't straight. The garden rows could be neater. The Quonset needs another coat of paint." Ellie laughed, and the sound startled a jay from the nearest oak. She recognized the truth in Harold's words. Walter Marsh had been a man of high standards, quick to notice imperfection, and she had spent decades interpreting that quickness as coldness. She had been wrong. Beneath every correction had been the unspoken belief that his daughter was capable of better, which was its own form of faith. which was its own dialect of love. I found something yesterday, Harold continued. In the cellar, behind some of the canning supplies. I think Biscuit led me to it, actually. What kind of something come I see? The cellar had become Harold's domain over the months, organized with the meticulous care he had once applied to the farmhouse workshop, where he built birdhouses and repaired small engines, and performed 1,000 quiet acts of maintenance that kept a home alive. Shelves lined with preserved vegetables from the garden he tended, with the seriousness of a man conducting important research. Root crops stored in sand, herbs hanging from ceiling beams to dry their brittle leaves, releasing fragrance when you brushed past them. The space smelled of earth and patience, and the particular sweetness of food put up against winter by hands that remembered how. Biscuit descended the concrete steps ahead of them, his nails clicking with familiar authority, and led them to the far corner where the industrial shelving met the wall. Behind a row of mason jars filled with pickled beets, Harold's latest project, the jars glowing garnet in the dim light, barely visible, unless you knew to look, sat a small wooden box. I only found it because Biscuit kept pawing at the jars. I thought he was after a mouse, but he was very specific about this spot, very insistent. The box was perhaps 6 inches square, made of cedar, that had protected its contents from moisture and decades. Ellie carried it up the stairs into October light and opened it with hands that had rebuilt their steadiness through labor and purpose, the way a broken bone rebuilds through use. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, 2 items. A ring, a woman's band set with a small diamond that caught the autumn sun and scattered it into fragments of rainbow across the tailgate where Ellie had set the box, and a folded piece of paper. She recognized the ring immediately. It had belonged to her grandmother, Walter's mother, a woman who died before Ellie was born, but whose photograph had hung in the farmhouse hallway for as long as memory reached. In the photograph, the ring was visible on her grandmother's left hand, catching light from a window that no longer existed in a house that had been torn down before the Korean War. The paper, when she unfolded it, contained her father's handwriting. Blockier than the journal entries, the letters less certain, as though written by a hand that had grown older, and less steady, but no less deliberate. This ring belonged to my mother. She wore it every day of her married life and asked that it be passed to someone who understood what marriage really means. Not the ceremony or the legal papers, but the choice to stay when staying is hard. I never gave it to your mother because she already had her own mother's ring, and this one was meant to wait for the right moment. If you found this, you found the rest of what I left behind. You've done the hard work of discovery. You've proven that you don't give up. Give this ring to Harold. He's earned it. So have you. Ellie held the ring up to the light. The diamond was small but clear, a point of concentrated fire throwing tiny rainbows against the Quonset wall, like signals from a shore she couldn't see. Your grandmother's ring. Harold's voice had gone quiet in the way it did when emotion threatened to overwhelm his natural reserve. He saved it all this time. He saved it for you. She turned to face her husband. 82 years old, thinner than he should have been. His hair gone white and his face mapped with the accumulated weather of a lifetime spent mostly outdoors. But his eyes were clear and present and filled with something that required no translation. May I? Harold nodded. His left hand, where his original wedding ring sat thin and worn from 62 years of daily wear, remained steady as Ellie slid her grandmother's ring onto his finger beside the original band. It fit as though it had been measured for him, the 2 rings side by side, one from 1962 and one from perhaps the 1920s, a chain of devotion stretching back through generations. I, Eleanor Marsh, take you Harold Marsh to be my husband again. Still, always. We're already married, you old fool, his eyes bright. I know, but I wanted to say it again. I wanted you to know that if I had to do it all over, every struggle, every loss, every frozen night in that parking lot, I'd choose you without hesitation. I choose this life. I choose us. She kissed his forehead, and Biscuit padded over from the cellar stairs and settled at their feet, his warmth anchoring them to the present moment, the way ballast anchors a ship. 3 days later, Ellie was reorganizing the workshop section of the Quonset, rearranging her father's tools into a system that Walter himself would have approved of when she found the second box. Not hidden by Biscuit this time. She found it herself behind the pegboard wall, where the heavy tools hung tucked into a gap between the steel shelving and the Quonset's curved wall that she had simply never explored, because there had always been something more urgent to do. A cedar box twin to the first, inside letters, dozens of them tied with twine that fell apart at her touch, spilling across the workbench, in a cascade of yellowed paper and faded ink, and the ghost of a fragrance that Ellie identified after a stunned moment as her mother's perfume. Letters between Walter and Dorothy. Written over decades from before their marriage through the years of Ellie's childhood, ending only with Dorothy's death in 1992. Her parents had maintained a secret correspondence within their own home, writing to each other. The things they could not or would not say aloud, documenting their interior lives in a private language that no one else was meant to read. Ellie sat on a shop stool surrounded by the evidence of a love she had lived beside for 35 years and never once suspected existed. A letter from Dorothy dated 1955. Walter, my love. Ellie asked me today why you work so hard. I told her that her father is building something. Not just a farm, but a future. She didn't understand. She's only 12. But someday she will. I watch you sometimes when you don't know I'm looking. The way you study the horizon, the way you plan for storms that haven't formed yet. I know the war changed you. I know you carry fears you'll never speak aloud. But I want you to know that I'm not afraid. Whatever you're preparing for, whatever you think might come, I trust you. We'll face it together, my darling, whatever comes. A letter from Walter dated 1962. I'm not doing this because I expect disaster. I'm doing this because I can't bear the thought of you or Ellie ever being helpless. If I can build a safety net strong enough to catch you both, then whatever happens to me doesn't matter. You'll be protected. That's all I've ever wanted. Ellie wept. Not the controlled tears of the bank vault. These were the tears of a woman whose understanding of her own history had just been rewritten. Whose image of her father, the silent man, the practical man, the man who showed love through labor, because he didn't know any other way, had cracked open to reveal a depth of feeling and terror and devotion that 60 years of living beside him had failed to illuminate. He loved them with a ferocity that frightened him, and the fear had expressed itself as the only thing Walter Marsh knew how to build: preparation, provision, the quiet, invisible architecture of protection. That night she read some of the letters aloud to Harold. They sat in the living space they had created, comfortable now with real furniture and photographs on the walls and rugs on the concrete floor, with Biscuit stretched between them like a bridge made of fur and loyalty. They had a whole relationship we never saw, Harold's voice carrying the specific weight of wonder. All those years writing love letters under the same roof. I thought Dad was just practical, emotionless almost. But he was feeling everything. He just couldn't let it show. Harold was quiet for a while, watching the fire through the wood stove's glass door. Then, with the careful precision of a man who has been thinking about something for a long time, Ellie, do you see it? You've been angry at your children for not understanding you, for not seeing the love behind your actions. He gestured at the letters. But your father spent his whole life doing the same thing, loving you in ways you couldn't see until he'd been gone nearly half a century. Ellie started to argue. Stopped. Harold was right with a completeness that made arguing pointless. Dennis did real harm, intentionally. Karen chose coldness when she could have chosen kindness. Those are their sins. But Stephen... He shook his head. Stephen just wasn't strong enough. And maybe some of that is ours. We protected him too much, fought his battles because he seemed too fragile, then wondered why he never learned to fight. We taught them that, and the admission cost her something. She could feel departing some burden she'd carried so long. She'd mistaken it for part of her skeleton. We told them our job was to sacrifice and theirs was to receive. We modeled giving without ever teaching that giving was supposed to go both ways. I need to write to Stephen. Stephen's letter had arrived in October, handwritten on plain paper with a crooked stamp. He did not ask for money or forgiveness or a place in their lives. He wrote about volunteering at a food bank, about learning to give without expectation, about meeting people who had lost everything and recognizing his own parents in their faces. I'm not asking to visit. I just wanted you to know that not all of your children forgot what you taught us. Some of us just weren't strong enough to live up to it. Ellie wrote her response over a weak 12 drafts biscuit at her feet, through every attempt occasionally lifting his head with an expression suggesting editorial dissatisfaction. She stopped trying to write perfectly and wrote truly. Stephen, I got your letter. I'm not going to pretend everything is fine because it isn't. What happened caused real harm. Your father and I nearly died. That's not exaggeration. I'm also not going to pretend I'm blameless. Your father and I have talked honestly about how we raised you, about patterns we created without seeing them. Maybe we taught you that parents exist to sacrifice and children exist to receive. I'm writing because I don't want to be the kind of person who closes doors forever. I learned recently that my father loved me in ways I never recognized, spent his whole life protecting me through means I didn't understand until decades after he was gone. I don't want that to happen with us. I love you because you're my son, but I don't trust you. Trust only rebuilds through action. She mailed it before she could reconsider. Winter settled over Mill Creek Road with patient inevitability. Snow softened the property's edges and transformed the Quonset's roof into a white arc that held moonlight. Frank Olson called in December. Jake Whitfield had been hired as head mechanic at the garage outside town. Skills learned alongside Ellie had carried him through the interview. Megan's preserves sold out every Saturday at the farmer's market recipes Harold taught her. They moved out of the trailer park, Frank reported, renting a house on Elm Street. The boy's growing like a weed. Ellie set the phone down and stood at the kitchen window watching snow fall. She thought about Walter preparing in secret, about herself helping the Whitfields differently, not through hidden caches, but directly with the expectation that help received would become help given forward. She had corrected her father's method without abandoning his purpose. The arc was not closed. Arcs never fully close, but it had bent towards something recognizable. Walter to Ellie, to Jake and Megan. Each generation passing forward not just resources, but philosophy that help. Given freely creates a debt repaid not to the giver, but to the next person who needs it. Stephen's reply arrived in February. Brief, still volunteering, not asking for anything, just letting her know he was still there. Ellie wrote back. 3 sentences, enough to acknowledge without absolving. April returned with an urgency that felt personal, as though spring itself had been waiting for permission. Fruit trees erupted in white blossoms. Harold's garden bed stood dark and ready. The creek ran clear. Ellie was on her knees planting seed potatoes with Megan when Biscuit raised his head from the patch of sun where he'd been dozing. He did not growl, did not bark. His tail moved slowly, cautiously, the wag of a dog who recognized a scent but hadn't decided what it meant. A car came up the drive. Old Dusty, unremarkable. Stephen stepped out, thinner than she remembered. New lines around his eyes, jeans and a work shirt and boots with actual dirt. He stood beside his car with his hands at his sides, in a posture she had never seen on him. Not confidence exactly, but something harder won. The stance of a man who had walked to a door knowing it might not open, and knocked anyway. Biscuit rose and crossed the yard without haste, his grey muzzle carrying 11 years of accumulated judgment. He sniffed Stephen's hand thoroughly carefully, with the professional attention of a customs inspector examining a questionable passport. Then he sat down beside Stephen's feet and looked back at Ellie. Not an endorsement, not a rejection, a provisional verdict. Megan read the air between mother and son. You want me to go, stay. There's nothing here that needs hiding. Ellie stood, her knees protested. She walked to her son and stopped 3 feet away. You came. I came. I don't know if I'm allowed to be here. But I couldn't just write letters anymore. The breeze carried apple blossom scent, and a cardinal sang its two-note claim from the oaks. How do you find the place? Stephen looked around. At the Quonset standing solid in new paint. At the garden, the fruit trees, the solar panels, the farm all in the clearing. His eyes were wet, but his voice held. I see you built everything back from nothing. I see you did what I wasn't brave enough to help with. You own a hoe. He blinked. What a hoe. We're planting potatoes. If you came to talk, we talk. But we talk while we work. This isn't a therapy office. It's a farm. Stephen looked at Megan, a stranger kneeling in his mother's garden. Someone whose presence told a story he didn't yet know, and then at Ellie. And for the first time in longer than either could measure, Stephen Marsh smiled. Small, uncertain, but unrehearsed. I don't have a hoe. Tool shed's over there. Your grandfather left enough for a platoon. He went. He came back. 3 people planted potatoes in April's sun for an hour, without speaking the silence between them. Not empty but full. The way a held breath is full. Biscuit lay at the garden's edge, watching with the patience of a creature who understood that some things cannot be hurried. When they talked, it was not the reconciliation movies manufacture. No embrace, no swelling music. 2 people beginning a process that might take years with no guarantee of completion. Stephen spoke about the food bank. His voice carried weight it had never held before. I met people who lost everything, and I realized that was you. That was Dad. And I let it happen. You didn't let it happen. You didn't stop it. Those are different things, different enough to matter I don't know yet. But you're here. Hands in the dirt. That's a start. Stephen stayed for dinner. Harold spoke plainly without cruelty or comfort. I'm disappointed, but I'm too old to spend whatever time I have left holding grudges against my own blood. Stephen drove home that evening. No promises, no requests. But Ellie knew with the particular certainty of a woman who had raised a child and watched him walk away, and now watched him walk back, that he would come again. Biscuit stood on the porch watching taillights disappear, then settled at Ellie's feet. His tail moved once slow, deliberate, the considered verdict of a judge who had weighed the evidence at length. You approve. Biscuit closed his eyes. Sufficient. That night, Ellie sat at the table Harold had rescued from a barn sale. Biscuit beneath it, Harold reading by the window with his glasses perched on her nose. He refused to admit needed them. She wrote not for anyone in particular, not a letter or a journal. She wrote because some truths are too large for a single mind and must be set down somewhere outside the body before they can be fully understood. What I know now that I didn't know a year ago, that starting over is possible at any age, but it requires releasing what you thought your life was supposed to be. That the people who love you sometimes show it in ways you won't recognize until decades after they're gone. That forgiveness isn't pretending hurt didn't happen. It's deciding that hurt won't be the last word. That a dog can teach you more about loyalty than most humans will learn in a lifetime. That home isn't a place you find. It's a place you build one nail at a time, one decision at a time, one act of stubborn faith at a time. She folded the letter, carried it down the cellar stairs. Biscuit following his nails, clicking in a rhythm she would know anywhere. She placed the letter in the cedar box beside her parents' correspondence. Set the box on the same shelf where Walter's metal box had sat for 70 years. A daughter's words resting where her father's preparations had waited. She climbed the stairs and leaned down to kiss Harold's forehead, where he dozed, book open, on his chest. What was that for? For being here, for staying, for believing we could build something when everyone else decided we couldn't. We did build something. He caught her hand and held it against his cheek, and the ring, his grandmother's ring, pressed warm between their skin. We built a life worth living. Biscuit crossed the room and settled between their legs. His fur silver now where gold had been a year ago, his muzzle white, his hips stiff on cold mornings. But his eyes were unchanged, amber and knowing, and fixed on Ellie with an attention that 11 years had not diminished. Outside, the last light found the Quonset's curved roof and turned corrugated steel into something that belonged in a painting. warm, improbable, defiant against the darkening sky. The creek held its conversation with the stones. The fruit trees held their blossoms against a sky deepening from blue to violet to the black velvet that Iowa wears at night. Eleanor Marsh stood in a home she had built from wreckage and inheritance and refusal. She was 81 years old. She had been robbed by her own children and abandoned by her community, and left with $900 and a borrowed van and a dog who found things that were hidden. She had purchased a ruin and discovered a fortune, and faced down a lawsuit and rebuilt a life and opened a door she had every right to keep locked forever. And she was home. Not because she had nowhere else to go, because she had looked at everything the world offered and chosen this. This man, this land, this dog, this steel cathedral. Her father had prepared across 30 years of devotion that asked for nothing in return except to be needed someday by the person he loved most. She would not give up. She had not given up. And the land, patient, generous, indifferent to the laughter of auctioneers and the greed of sons who forgot where they came from, had kept its oldest promise.